My name is Rick Stewart. And before I tell you everything, before I tell you about the suit, the photograph, and the night my wife froze when she saw me walk through those elevator doors, I need you to hear the exact words she said to me. Because those words are where this story really begins. Rick, honestly, this crowd isn't really your world. I don't want you to feel out of place. They'll know you don't belong there. She said it calmly, measured, the way you say something you've been rehearsing inside your head for weeks. And I stood there in our kitchen, paint on my boots, coffee in my hand, and I nodded. I said, okay. And I smiled. That smile bothered her. I could tell. She picked up her earring, looked at me one more second longer than necessary, and then she left. She didn't know what the smile meant, but I did. It meant, now I know exactly what I need to do. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me take you back to the morning it really started. Not the night she said those words, but the Tuesday 3 weeks earlier, when I was eating eggs at our kitchen table and my wife forgot, for the first time out loud, what kind of man she had married. I grew up in Linden, Ohio. You've never heard of it, and that's accurate. It was a steel town that the economy walked away from before I hit double digits. My father worked 3 jobs, overnight security, weekend roofing, and whatever odd labor a man could find between those 2 things. He was never home, and when he was home, he was tired in a way that lived in his bones. He died owing the bank $14,000. He left me nothing except a callousness in my hands, and one sentence he said to me the winter before he passed. Don't let them see what you're building until it's already built. I took that seriously, maybe too seriously. By the time I was 22, I was doing concrete and pipe work during the day and teaching myself to code at night in the back of a rented trailer with a laptop I bought secondhand. Not because I had a plan exactly, but because I had a feeling that automation was coming for every industry, and someone was going to write the software that ran it, and that someone might as well be me. I wasn't loud about it. I wasn't loud about anything. That Tuesday, Aya was in the next room recording a podcast interview for a literary show, some host named Trevor who laughed at everything she said. I could hear her through the wall, warm and polished, talking about her journey. Then Trevor asked about her personal life, and Aya laughed and said, "My husband is very blue-collar. Wonderfully so. He pours concrete for a living. It keeps us grounded." I put my fork down. I looked at my coffee. I didn't say anything. I didn't walk in there. I didn't correct her. I simply opened my laptop and pulled up the dashboard for RW Systems, my logistics software company, and looked at the numbers sitting in the quarterly column. $4.1 million. I closed the laptop. I washed my dish. I kissed her on the cheek on my way out. She smiled at me without pausing the interview, and I drove to the job site in my truck. I thought about my father the whole way there. I thought about what he would say if he could see me driving that truck, wearing those boots, listening to a woman tell the world I was nothing more than the calluses on my hands. He probably would have laughed. Not a mean laugh. A knowing one. Don't let them see what you're building until it's already built. I was almost done building. The formal invitation arrived on a Wednesday. I know it was Wednesday because I had just come off a 12-hour pour. The kind of job where your lower back stops talking to you around hour 8 and your legs go quiet somewhere after that. I came home with concrete dust in my collar and that specific exhaustion that only lives in your hands after a full day of real work. Aya was at the kitchen table with her laptop open, forwarding emails. I could see the subject line from the doorway. "You're invited. The Aya Stewart $1 million deal signing. One night only, Meridian Rooftop, Manhattan." She was glowing, and she should have been. 6 years of writing that novel. 6 years of rejections, of 2 a.m. rewrites, of reading chapters out loud to me in bed while I lay there with my eyes closed. Not asleep, just listening. 6 years of her carrying something enormous and heavy and completely her own. She deserved every bit of that glow. I stood in the doorway and watched her forward that email 17 times. Her editor, her agent, her college roommate Simone, her publicist Dana, 3 authors she'd met at a conference in Atlanta, 2 journalists, a cousin in Maryland she barely spoke to. 17 people in 11 minutes. I showered. I came back downstairs. I made a plate of food and sat at the kitchen table across from her, and she was still at her laptop, still glowing, and I said, casually, the way you say something when you already know the answer but you need to hear it spoken out loud. So when do I get my invite? She laughed. Not a mean laugh, a distracted one. The kind that means the question barely registered. She said, I'll put you on the list, babe. I nodded. I ate my food. I didn't push. That was 3 weeks before the event. The list never came. I checked the mail every day, not obsessively, just the way a man checks something he already knows the outcome of, because he needs to confirm it with his own hands before he allows himself to feel it. Bills, magazines, a catalog for garden equipment we'd never use. Every day, nothing. I'd set the stack back down exactly where I found it and go upstairs and sit on the edge of our bed in the dark for a few minutes before she came up. I want to be precise about what I felt during those 3 weeks. It wasn't anger, not yet. It was something quieter and more durable than anger. It was clarity, the kind of clarity that arrives slowly, without drama, like a tide coming in. Each day the mail came and my name wasn't in it. The water rose a little higher. A week before the event, I asked her again. That was the night she said what she said. The calm words, the careful ones. They'll know you don't belong there. After she left for that pre-event dinner, I sat in the kitchen for a long time. Then I picked up my phone and called Marcus Webb, my attorney of 9 years, the only man outside of a private equity boardroom who knew exactly what I was worth. He picked up on the second ring. I said, Marcus, I need to update some documents. Yes, tonight. He went quiet for exactly 3 seconds. Then, Rick, how serious are we talking? I looked at the stack of mail on the table. I looked at the empty chair where she'd been sitting, still warm, her coffee cup still there with her lipstick on the rim. I don't know yet, I said. Get it ready. I'll tell you what to do with it when I'm ready. I hung up. I turned the kitchen light off. I sat in the dark for a while longer. Somewhere in Manhattan, Aya was at a dinner with publishers and agents and literary people, laughing that warm, polished laugh of hers, being exactly who she'd decided to become. And I was sitting in the dark in our kitchen, deciding exactly who I was going to be when I walked into that room. Let me take you back further than that night. Let me take you back 8 months, because that's where the real story lives, not in the words she said to me in the kitchen, but in the dinner that taught her to say them. It was a Thursday evening in October. Aya had been invited to a literary gathering at a restaurant in Cincinnati, the kind of place with no prices on the menu and lighting so dim you feel like you're being interviewed. Our editor James was there, her new agent Patricia, 2 other authors whose names I recognized from bookstore windows, and me. I wore the nicest thing I owned at the time, dark jeans, a collared shirt, clean boots. I wasn't embarrassed. I didn't know I was supposed to be. I talked about the job site because someone asked what I did. I talked about the specific satisfaction of watching a foundation set, how there's a window of time when concrete is neither liquid nor solid, just this temporary in-between thing, and you have to read it right or the whole structure suffers. I thought it was interesting. One of the authors nodded politely. Patricia checked her phone. James laughed at something someone else said. At one point I laughed too loud at a joke. I heard myself do it and I didn't care, because it was actually funny, but I saw Aya's jaw tighten from across the table. On the drive home she was quiet. I counted the minutes without meaning to. 11 minutes of silence. Then she said, Rick, I love you, but you make it hard to be taken seriously in these spaces. I looked out the window at the highway lights. I didn't say anything because I was doing the math. I was calculating the distance between the woman who read a half-finished chapter at a library open mic and cried afterward because nobody clapped, and the woman sitting next to me right now, concerned about how my laugh landed in a dim restaurant. That was 8 months before the signing event. I watched the distance grow every week after that. Aya started changing her clothes first. That's always how it starts, the outside, because it's the easiest thing to control. Then her circle. The friends she called on the phone got quieter and fewer. Dana replaced most of those conversations. Then the way she described her life in interviews changed. The courthouse wedding disappeared from her origin story. I became my partner, vague, unspecific, a placeholder. Once, in a magazine profile I found on the kitchen counter, she described herself as essentially self-made. I read that line 3 times. I put the magazine back exactly where I found it. I want to be clear about something. I was never angry at Aya's success. Not for a single second. I had watched her earn every word of it. What I was doing, in those months, was something my father taught me to do with concrete. I was reading the mixture. I was watching to see if it would hold. So by the time she stood in our bedroom 3 weeks before the Manhattan event, putting on her earrings for that pre-event dinner, by the time she turned to me and said those careful, rehearsed words, I had already been watching for 8 months. Rick, honestly, this crowd isn't really your world. I don't want you to feel out of place. They'll know you don't belong there. I looked at her for a moment. This woman in the black dress. This woman whose chapters 1 had printed and annotated for years. This woman I married in a thrift store dress in a $200 courthouse ceremony. Both of us laughing so hard in the photograph that you couldn't read our faces as anything except pure, unguarded joy. I smiled. Not a hurt smile. Not a bitter one. The smile of a man who has just finished reading the mixture and knows exactly what it's going to do. I said, "You're probably right." I turned back to the television. She stood there for a beat longer than she needed to. Something about the smile bothered her. I could see it move across her face like a shadow. She almost said something. Her mouth opened slightly and then closed again. She picked up her earring. She left. The front door shut behind her, and the house went completely quiet, and I sat there in the television light, and I thought about a tailor in Chicago that a business contact had mentioned to me twice. A man named Marco Bellini who had dressed 3 Fortune 500 CEOs and who, according to my contact, had a way of seeing things in a man that the man himself hadn't decided to show yet. I picked up my phone. I made the appointment. I drove to Chicago on a Friday morning, alone, telling Aya I had a psych consultation in Columbus. That was the only lie I told her through this entire thing. One lie, in one direction, to protect something I wasn't ready to show yet. I've thought about that a lot since. Whether it counts, whether it changes anything. I've decided it doesn't. Not because lying is acceptable, but because everything else I did was simply silence. And silence isn't the same thing as deception. Silence is just a man reading the mixture. Marco Bellini's shop was on a side street in the West Loop that didn't look like anything from the outside. No sign that I could read from the car. A single Aya number above the door. I checked the address twice before I went in. The inside was different. Quiet the way expensive things are quiet. Not empty, but contained. Bolts of fabric along one wall, dark and ordered. A 3-panel mirror at the far end. The smell of something pressed and warm. A man behind a long wooden table who didn't look up when I walked in, which told me immediately that he was the kind of person who decided when an interaction began. He was in his late 60s, gray at the temples, hands that moved with the specific patience of someone who had done precise things for 50 years and no longer needed to think about them. He let me stand there for a full 10 seconds. Then he looked up. He didn't look at my clothes. I noticed that specifically, because most people, when they're in the business of clothing, look at what you're wearing first. Marco looked at my posture, my hands, the way I was standing. He studied me the way I study a foundation site before a pour, reading what's underneath before committing to the surface. Then he said, "First time wearing something like this, or first time letting people see it?" I stood there for a moment. "Second one," I said. He nodded slowly, not surprised. The nod of a man confirming something he'd already suspected. He came around the table and gestured for me to step onto the low platform in front of the mirror, and I did, and he began taking measurements without asking me a single question about the occasion or the event or who I was trying to impress. I appreciated that. We worked in silence for a long time. He moved around me with his measuring tape the way water moves around something solid, finding every edge, noting every dimension, making no comment. I watched myself in the 3-panel mirror and tried to recognize the man looking back. He was still wearing the same face, the same hands, but something about the way Marco was moving around him made him look like a different proposition entirely. Near the end, Marco was pinning the shoulder of a sample jacket he'd put on me to check the line. He was looking at the mirror, not at me, when he said, quietly, almost to himself, "Whoever she is, she's going to need a moment." I looked at his reflection. I didn't confirm it. I didn't deny it. I just held still while he finished the pin. He took the jacket off me and carried it back to his table and wrote something in a small notebook. Without looking up, he said, "It'll be ready in 5 days. You'll pay when you collect it." I said, "How much?" He named a number. I didn't blink. He noticed that I didn't blink, and something shifted in his expression. Not surprise exactly, but a quiet recalibration. The same look James Whitfield would give me 3 weeks later when I walked into the Meridian rooftop and half the room went still. But I didn't know about that yet. I paid the deposit. I shook Marco's hand. His grip was firm and brief, the handshake of a man who doesn't waste anything. At the door I paused, my hand on the frame, and I looked back at him. He was already writing in his notebook again. I thought about asking him how many men had stood on that platform before a moment that would change everything. How many of them had driven there alone, told a half-truth to the person they loved, and stood in front of a 3-panel mirror trying to recognize themselves. I didn't ask. I already knew the answer was, enough. I drove back to Ohio in the dark. Aya was asleep when I got home. I stood in our bedroom doorway for a moment, watching her breathe, thinking about the photograph on the fridge downstairs. The courthouse one, the one where we were both laughing. I went to the garage. I stood there alone for a while. Then I made the second phone call, the one to James Whitfield. James Whitfield picked up on the third ring. He always picked up on the third ring. I'd noticed that over the 4 years we'd been doing business together. Like he wanted you to think he was considering whether to answer. "Rick," he said, "it's been a while." "I'm ready to talk," I said. Silence. Then the full bio. "No, something different. I'll explain when I see you. But James, I need one more thing. The Meridian rooftop event in Manhattan. Aya's book deal signing." "I know the event," he said. And of course he did. Whitfield Grayson Capital had its fingerprints on half the literary publishing investments in the country, including the parent company of Aya's publisher. He existed in every room she was trying to enter. He just never mentioned it to her because she never asked the right questions about her husband. "I need a seat at that table," I said. "With you." Another silence. Longer this time. "Rick, does she know?" "No. Does she know anything about RW Systems? About the licensing deal with Meridian Logistics? About what that capital funded downstream?" "No," I said. "She thinks I pour concrete." The silence that followed was the longest one yet. Then James Whitfield, a man who had negotiated 9-figure acquisitions without raising his voice, laughed. Not a boardroom laugh. A genuine one. The laugh of a man who suddenly understood the shape of something remarkable. "You've been sitting on all of this," he said. "While she—" "Yes," I said. "And now?" I looked at the dark ceiling of my garage. I thought about Marco's words. "She's going to need a moment. Now I'm ready to be seen," I said. 3 days before the event, Dana Cho was at the venue reviewing the final guest list when she stopped breathing for approximately 4 seconds. "Aya Stewart. Table 4. VIP T." She asked the coordinator who booked it. "Direct reservation. Paid in full. No +1. She pulled up her phone and opened a file she'd built 8 months ago when she first signed Aya as a client. Because Dana did her research, always, on every variable in a client's life that could become a story. RW Systems. Founded 9 years ago. Logistics automation software. Licensing agreements with 7 major distribution networks across the country. Indirect capitalization running through Whitfield Grayson into at least 3 publishing industry funds, including the fund backing Aya's $1 million advance. Dana sat down in a catering chair and stared at the Manhattan skyline through the venue window. She wanted to call Aya. She reached for her phone twice. Both times she put it back down. She had one rule she never broke. She did not get between a client and their marriage. Whatever this was, a confrontation, a reconciliation, a detonation, it belonged to them. She closed the file. She ordered herself a coffee. She prayed for the first time in 4 years. The night before the event, I couldn't sleep. At 12:40 a.m., I went to the garage and set up the ironing board under the single hanging bulb, and I pressed that charcoal briny suit with the same focus I give a 12-hour pour. Slow. Deliberate. Every crease intentional. My phone buzzed on the workbench. "Marcus, paperwork is ready. You sure about this?" I stated the message. I thought about the open MIC night 11 years ago, a woman reading a half-finished chapter to a room that barely listened. I thought about the courthouse, the photograph, the way she looked at me like I was the most solid thing in her world. Then I thought about 11 minutes of silence on a highway. I typed back, "Hold it. Let me see who she is first." I set the phone down. I kept ironing. Upstairs, Aya slept without knowing that her husband was in the garage at midnight, pressing a suit that cost more than our first car, making a decision that would determine the rest of everything. The rooftop was electric. 300 people. Champagne. The kind of ambient music that costs money to sound effortless. Aya was radiant at the center of it. Black gown, natural hair pinned perfectly. Her editor James beside her, her agent crying happy tears nearby. Cameras flashed every few seconds. The Manhattan skyline sat behind everything like it had been hired for the occasion. I watched her from the parking garage across the street before I went in. Just for a moment. She was visible through the floor-to-ceiling windows, moving through that crowd like she'd been born for exactly this. And in a way, she had. 6 years of work. 6 years of carrying something heavy and private and entirely her own. I felt nothing but pride. Then I straightened my jacket, walked across the street, and stepped into the elevator with James Whitfield. We were mid-conversation, genuinely, not performatively, about a licensing structure we'd been discussing for weeks. He was laughing at something I'd said when the doors opened. I stepped out onto the rooftop, and 300 people did the thing that rooms do when something unexpected enters them. They shifted, without knowing why, the way a current shifts when a new weight enters the water. Across the room, Aya's champagne glass stopped halfway to her lips. She stared at me from across 300 people, and I watched the sequence move across her face like weather. Confusion first, then recognition, then something I can only describe as the ground moving. Her editor James saw me and straightened immediately. Her agent, who knew every major capital player in publishing, went completely still. Dana, standing near the bar, closed her eyes for exactly 2 seconds. I didn't move toward Aya. I let the room do its work. James Whitfield shook 2 hands near the elevator, said something into my ear about finding me later, and moved into the crowd. I stood where I was. Calm. The way concrete is calm after it sets. Not passive, just resolved. Aya started moving toward me. She was halfway across the room when James, her editor, intercepted her. I watched him grab her elbow. I watched his mouth move fast and low. I watched the color leave her face incrementally, like a tide going out. She looked across the room at me. I looked back at her. I didn't explain myself from a distance. I didn't mouth words or gesture. I simply stood in that suit in that room and let her see, fully, for the first time, exactly who she had been sleeping beside for 9 years. Her mouth formed my name. No sound came out. She found me on the terrace. Her editor had told her enough. I could see it in the way she was walking. Not angry. Unsteady. The specific unsteadiness of someone whose floor has just relocated. "Your company," she said. "RW Systems. The licensing deal with Meridian Logistics." James said it capitalized the fund that. "Yes," I said. "Did you do that on purpose? Did you engineer?" "Look at the dates," I said. I pulled out my phone. I opened the folder I'd prepared, not to defend myself, but because I knew this moment was coming and she deserved evidence, not argument. I showed her the incorporation certificate for RW Systems. 9 years ago, 2 years before we met. I showed her the first licensing agreement. 6 years ago, the same year she read that chapter at the Open MIC. "I didn't build this because of you," I said. "I built it before you existed in my life. I stayed quiet because I needed to know who you'd become when the world started clapping for you." She stayed at the phone, then at me. "You watched me," she said. "You watched me change, and you said nothing." "I was reading the mixture," I said. She didn't understand that yet, but she would. "Now I know," I said. The host called her to the podium 20 minutes later. I stood near the back of the room. I watched her walk up there in that black gown with 300 faces turned toward her, and I thought, whatever she does right now is the answer. The whole 9 years. The courthouse. The Open MIC. The 11 minutes of silence. The invitation that never came. All of it compressed into whatever she chose to do in the next 2 minutes. She reached the podium. She looked down at the prepared speech. 3 pages, Dana approved, carefully branded. She looked up at the room. Her eyes found mine in the back, and she held them there for 1 full second. She folded the speech, put it in her clutch. 3 seconds of silence. Then, I wrote this book about a woman who carries rivers. But the truth is I was carried by a man I told, to his face, that he didn't belong in rooms like this one. A murmur moved through the crowd. He built something extraordinary while I was asleep in the same house. And I couldn't see it, because I stopped looking at him. Her voice broke once. She steadied it. I'm looking now. The crowd thinned slowly after the speech. The music softened. Champagne glasses were abandoned half full on high tables. Dana found me near the bar and looked at me for a long moment without saying anything. Then she said, she didn't know. I know she didn't, I said. Are you going to be all right? Both of you. I didn't answer that directly. Not because I didn't know, but because the answer belonged to Aya first. I found her by the elevator, heels in her hand, jacket over one arm. The radiance of earlier was still there but quieter now, like a light with the wattage turned to something sustainable. She looked at me the way she used to look at me, directly, without performance. Marcus, she said, the paperwork. What were you going to do? I reached into my breast pocket and pulled out the photograph. Small, worn at the edges. The courthouse wedding. Both of us laughing so hard our faces were barely readable. I held it out. She took it carefully, like it was something that could break. I was going to see who you were when the lights were on you, I said. If she was still the woman who read half a chapter and meant every word, I was going to tear the paperwork up. She looked at the photograph for a long time. Then, I tore it up, I said. In the car, before I came in. She looked up at me. Her eyes were doing something complicated and honest and entirely her own. I held out my arm. She put the photograph carefully in her clutch, next to the folded speech. She took my arm. The elevator opened. We went home.